Bom dia a todas, a todos e a todes. As pessoas estão chegando devagarinho. Bom, meu nome é Rozeli Porto, sou professora da Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Norte, Natal, do Departamento e do Programa de Pós-graduação em Antropologia Social, e também estou atuando agora como secretária adjunta da ANPOCS. Bom, é um prazer e uma honra para a nossa associação, em seu 47º Encontro Nacional, ter como conferencista a professora Anne Stoller, a quem agradecemos a disponibilidade para realizar essa conferência e a quem apresento de modo resumido, a partir do seu extenso e interessante currículo acadêmico. Anne Laura Stoller leciona Antropologia e Estudos Históricos na New School for Social Research, na cidade de Nova York, sendo também diretora do Institute for Critical Social Inquiry. Lecionou na Universidade de Michigan, de 1989... Não. Perdão. Não, até New School. Ok. E está agora na New School for Social Research, desde 2004, onde foi presidente fundadora do Departamento de Antropologia. Anne foi professora visitante na Escola de Altos Estudos, na Escola Normal Superior de Paris 8, na Escola de Crítica e Teoria da Universidade de Cornell, na Universidade de Birdseye, em Ramallah, the Johannesburg Workshop in Theory and Criticism, Irvine's School of Arts and Literature, and the Bird Prison Initiative. Dentre outras homenagens e distinções, foi premiada em 2005 pela Fundação norueguesa alemã Willy Brandt com o título de Willy Brandt Distinguished Professor. Entrevistas recentes com ela estão disponíveis em Savage Minds, Le Monde e Public Culture, Pacific Radio, bem como se pode encontrar as palestras dela pelos canais do YouTube. Stoller possui importantes publicações, tais como Race and Education, Race and Education of Desire, Foucault's History of Sexuality and the Colonial Order of Things, de 1995, Carnal Knowledge and Imperial Power, de 2002, Duress, Imperial Durabilities in Our Times, 2016, Interior Frontiers, A Science of the Encontro Anual da ANPOCS, de 2022. Seu compromisso em unir investigação conceitual e histórica levou a um trabalho colaborativo com historiadores, com filósofos, e, mais recentemente, a criação da revista Political Concepts. Possui contribuições significativas para os campos de estudos coloniais e pós-coloniais, economia política, antropologia histórica e epistemologias raciais e teoria feminista. Em seu último livro, Interior Frontiers, Stoller provoca um rico debate sobre o legado do colonialismo e as atuais condições políticas das democracias imperiais euro-americanas. Em livros anteriores, como em Duress, Anne Stoller questiona qual seria a importância das histórias coloniais para as urgências e condições do nosso mundo atual. Como é que essas histórias foram tantas vezes apresentadas como restos, como legados de um passado morto, em vez de forças ativas e violadoras do mundo de hoje? Stoller considera nesse livro que renovações metodológicas podem servir para escrever histórias que não cedam nem a continuidades suaves, nem a rupturas abruptas de época, capturando as qualidades desiguais e recursivas das visões e práticas que as formações imperiais animaram. Stoller, através de um conjunto de reconsiderações conceituais e concretas que localizam os efeitos e práticas políticas que os projetos imperiais produzem, histórias oclusas, soberanias graduadas, regimes de segurança afetiva, novos racismos, exposições corporais, detritos ativos e arquipélagos carcerários de colônias e campos que hoje esculpem a distribuição de desigualdades e profundas falhas de coação. Bom, dito isso, então, passo a palavra à nossa convidada para proferir a conferência intitulada Shatterzones of Inequality, Democracy and Colonialism Today. Então, a palavra está com a professora Anne Stoller. Sim? Sim.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you for being here. I actually have 3 introductions today that I wasn't able to give all of yesterday. This is my last day. It's my last afternoon. I get, unfortunately, to get on a plane this evening. So this is kind of a special day for me. I know it's a special day for you tonight when you get to celebrate. But before I begin, I do have something I need to say, and for those who were here yesterday, I don't think I apologize. I'll just say it again. Dissensus from state mandates is something in which many of us share, are invested in, and take as our responsibility to do. Before beginning this morning, I want to mark a morning. Louder? Oh, see, I was told not to go too close. I want to mark, is that better? To mark a mourning in black of the ongoing, accelerating massacre and annihilation of, as of yesterday, 7,000 Palestinians, and it hasn't been updated as of this morning. Many of whom, and I think it's really important to remember, are not Hamas supporters. Really, nor have they ever been. It's all confusing. Apropos of our subject today and yesterday, I want to ask as we approach the Shatterzones of Inequality, whether incarcerated, crushed, starved, and tortured Palestinians from Gaza to the West Bank will be the only Palestinians archives left. I don't think that was a question just for our subject yesterday. Equality, as we know, colonial and democratic ones, are fictive narratives and political histories of the present. Before I begin, I want to thank, and I'll do it as fast as I can because it's pretty incredible, from Campinas to Rio to Bahia, the number of people, not only who have hosted me, but have been so incredible in teaching me new things, in exchanging with me, in showing me places I've never been, that I knew about, the favelas, right? I knew about them, that doesn't mean I know them. These people I would start with, and I'll try to make it brief, are Gabriela Rodrigo de Gularosa, who is the person who made this happen. Never in a million years would I think, writing your dissertation or otherwise, you could make it happen. Gustavo Rossi, who has done so much to make this place feel comfortable from the very first day, with Cristiano, I know I'm pronouncing it wrong, Chris, Tambacia. In Rio, Rodrigo Pulama, Janine Schurz, who was not from here, but came that first day from the airport, Susana Maya, Livio Samson, who I just saw somewhere, but maybe not, Marcello, Morda, Nello, Vivi Grunwald, who gave comments yesterday, a graduate student who wanted to come to the new school, Paulo de Freitas, Natalia Padovani, Mariana Chogue, and of course, Professor Mello, who is one of the executive board, one of those on the executive board. So I'm going to take a little more time today since we don't have a commentary afterwards of 15 to 20 minutes, and this is the last moment. And I've written this paper only for you. I spent weeks and weeks writing it Some of it has various ideas I've worked through in Interior Frontiers, but it's quite different. And it's a kind of new venture for me, and you'll see why. 150 years ago, Nietzsche wrote a thought haunting and piercing, with a lucidity so poignant now, and from which most of us would turn away. As he put it takes strength, he said, to be able to live and forget, the extent to which to live and to be unjust are one and the same thing. Wow, 150 years ago. Thank you for having me here, as I said, at this moment in this place. I'm honored, overwhelmed by the generous welcome, and taken with and humbled by the work of Brazilian, I consider so many people I've met activist scholars, right? That I've been meeting, glued to reading. Students and faculty alike have made sure I'm not totally cloistered behind academic walls. And I thank them too for introducing me to those who do not want to be academics. If by all measures my immersion is too short, it has produced a ravenous desire to ingest as much as I can about Brazil's conditions of democracy and inequality, the breaches of the former, the durability of the latter. However much the subject of my talk today is somewhere else, I'm struck, and it's hard not to be, by something that almost feels familiar, the racialized inequalities of a purported democracy, now called out, named and challenged for so many years, so distinct from the former public face of racial democracy that many celebrated in the 1970s in the US, already 20 years after the UNESCO conference declaring Brazil's racial harmony. I was a graduate student at Columbia University when numbers of our esteemed liberal faculty, some of the names you know very well, perhaps not surprisingly, embraced and took solace in what we students saw as its racial democracy's mythic qualities. We were feisty grad students, proclaiming ourselves radical anthropologists. We were not ready to subscribe. Somehow that early moment remains entangled in the problems, the performative politics of how racism is understood in the longue durée of contemporary Euro-American politics. It is recognized, and this is something key for me, is recognized as a problem, but an external one to democracy itself, one separated out from the true democratic heart of those polities today. And again, the contexts and places in which I've worked for some 5 decades are far from Brazil. First, with landless women in Java, confronted with the Green Revolution and their loss of work. Later, with former Javanese, cooks, gardeners, nursemaids in Dutch colonial homes, whose memories, not surprisingly, drastically countered those of their white employers, who called them, quote unquote, and you'll know the term, just like family. In North Suvatra's vast agribusiness belt, palm oil and rubber plantations owned by, among others, Uniroyal and Goodyear, were living in a village of estate workers, got me totally cut off and ousted from talking to any US managers. They would have nothing to do with me. And literally years in the Dutch and French colonial archives, interlaced with something very important for me, trucking the extreme right in southern France. I've often wondered whether that flip back and forth between a looming, ever-increasing extreme right party no longer extreme now, on the one hand, and on the other, the pervasive and insistent production of racialized subjects that French and Dutch colonial archives documented in the margins of their official report, set one of the scenes where hardened fundamental inequalities reverberated through some of the commensurabilities I want to talk about today. Thus, despite those differences of location, it's hard not to be drawn to the disturbing affinities and how racisms rip through generations, bear down on people's possibilities, making precarity both under colonialism and in alleged democratic Euro-American polities, the very terms in which some live. But I hope that my vantage point is very clear. I am not implicitly, explicitly, or surreptitiously seeking out a comparison with Israel. I'm sorry, with Brazil. Israel's on my mind. I dream about Palestine and Israel. I talk to my family. Israel is just on my mind. I'm not trying to do a comparison. I would not be that arrogant. I don't know Brazil enough. And the many people who have not spent time here, US scholars, do it. I refuse to do it. Voracious reading, probably read 50 essays since Gabriela invited me a year ago, is not enough. My project is elsewhere. In part, an exploration of how it is that even in the broad field of those devoted to the damages and violences of colonialism, there remains this profound occlusion as setting aside of how those damages work in their interstices of contemporary democracies. And should we go back to the 1840s, to that most lauded spokesman for democracy in America, we all know Alex de Tocqueville, who hailed America's democracy, but insisted at the same time that inequality was needed to flourish and survive, equality for some. We're looking at a hidebound and necessary requirement for a really long time. I think of it, and I call it, I quote, a democratic contract with inequality. It's not something that just happened. This is not something ancillary to democracy itself. So more broadly, this is an exercise in speculative mode, pushing democracy and colonialism up against one another as two logics of power, as David Harvey would call them, as two affective states demanding subsumptions and the unevenly distributed inequities of precarity and duress. I'm thinking here of a governing project and design of command in which the two are joined, that make of democracy and colonialism both subsidiaries of imperial formations, rather than focusing, as so many of us and I have done for years, on the contrast between the two, an analytic and research orientation I've pursued, as have many for years. Here I'm turning to a commensurability, far less often addressed, between colonial and democratic investments in inequality, exclusion, and extraction as foundational, if differently manifest in both. I consider both Shatterzones of Inequality. Shatterzone is an 18th century geological term that refers to an area of fissured boulders, severed through with cracks, crushed stone under pressure that splits from compression at its seams. Something extraordinary appears in the crevices of those fissures. In the space of the cuts, a network of veins often filled with precious, rich mineral deposits. The term shatter zone is rarely used, except it's relegated in international relations and political science, those in political science and international relations, as the borderlands of civility in the Middle East only, where primordial loyalties, always the term used, are said to reign in a Samuel Huntington world of the West and the rest. The racialized account need not be rehearsed. Anybody knows Huntington's work. The claim is that interscene warfare makes no room for democracy, as if we don't have it everywhere else. I see Shatter Zone otherwise as a metaphor and model of hardened, compressed inequalities across imperial formations in Euro-American imperial democracies where racial cleavages cut through interior and exterior frontiers. It may also be where those precious veins yield rich deposits, and I think we can find them in many places, Brazil and the US, of defiance, disruptions to the distorted distributions of precarity and neglect. These compressions may be in what are considered the outer reaches of imperial formations. That's sort of what colonial studies has always done. Thick in the colonial borderlands, or I think at the exclusionary heart of democracy itself. A condition Audre Lorde describes as, I quote, predatory inclusion, unquote. Not bad for how much it grasps so much. With one of the highest infant mortality rates in the world, the US remains ensconced as one of the models of democracy. For the underclass, abysmal housing, grossly inadequate health care, and the physical perils of toxic labor remain the norm for far more than many. Nor is there anything new in the divided and distributed cordoning of impoverished quarters for the well-heeled ones, the stricture so fierce that fencing or gates are not necessarily required. Urban infrastructural design, highways, parks, schools, and waste processing plants fulfill the democratic contract for inequality on its own. The outside, ever-increasing number of men of color warehoused in US prisons are the conditions for duress and debt. Homelessness and foreclosures follow for families, their communities, and not least for the post-incarcerated. Never having the possibility of really earning a living, much less a family wage. And they know it, and still take seminars. With me, I work in prisons, have for 80 years. Now I'm thinking of Israel and Palestine again, 75 years. 8 years, getting BA degrees that they know they're not going to be able to do much with. That's pretty intense, yeah? The distribution of selective duress is a diagnostic of early infirmity and death. I have long written how little Foucault, someone I work, as some of you know, I've been dedicated to, sought to locate colonialism, but not as a crucial site of power, committed, as he saw in Europe, to make, live, and let die. But struck that the one place when he talked about colonialism took hold for him with what he and Hannah Arendt saw as only the boomerang effect, really well known, Arendt and Foucault, the boomerang effect. That is a set of colonial models brought back to the West, never making clear that these were models of policing, not from the US colonization of the Philippines only, not only from intelligence, refined British intelligence, refined in the Middle East to become one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks in Europe. These two are ones I've underscored as part of the colonial durabilities in our times. But in so doing, I think we may miss how deeply that make live and let die under a democracy itself. And I'm not just talking about slavery. What Foucault called exposure to death, that's really powerful because of what the duration that it allows. Exposure to death and privation was the stuff of a democratic contract inscribed with racism early on. Rob Nixon, I think that I mentioned yesterday, elaborates on that exposure to death with an equally vicious subjacent feature of contemporary Euro-American states, perhaps more enabling because people use it all the time now, they get it, because the practices are more evident to document. Rob Nixon's concept is of slow violence, really powerful, that turns against the suddenness, constrained violence of murder, rape, of immediate death, with more emphasis on the elongation of multiple privations, like duress. It's a wearing down. It's a wearing down that would be hard to pin on any one administration, on any one strategy, because it has this accretion, this cumulative force, the amorphous agent that acts. The temporal extension of slow violence, duress, and exposure are incremental forms of the destruction of life. But by Nixon's account, it's a violence that can't be easily seen. I think he's off. Being slow doesn't necessarily make it hard to see. It makes it hard to look away. What I have called the politics of disregard. As he rightly put it, there was a Brazilian student in my class last year in which we talked about this, my graduate seminar, this spring, actually, last year. He riled at the claim, invisible, and he said, to whom? He asked, challenging the portrayal by Nixon and the entire rest of the class. As he rightly put it, invisibility depends on who is doing the looking. When and where. For those in prolonged distress, slow violence is neither hard to feel, to taste, to smell, or see. I want to point out something important to this venture. It's not only my own grappling with crafting a political lexicon that may be useful in identifying inequalities. I'm struck by how many fields of study there are who are looking for this sort of headless power of exclusion in liberal democratic states. I'm not claiming it's mine. I'm claiming that there are a whole bunch of us who are coming up with different vocabularies, right, to get at some of this quality, and surely of colonial ones. The cumulative effort is a collective one, I would argue, even if we don't already know each other. An amended lexicon of relations of power and the political concepts that get lodged and stuck as common nouns. Slow violence, predatory inclusion, imperial formations, interior frontiers, I'll argue, refigure the politics of knowledge, what we think we know and how we think we know it. Imperial formation is not an alternative word for empire. Less thing-like than a process of appropriation with moving parts. That's when I started developing 20 years ago. Imperial formations are just empire. Such formations are dependent on meting out postponements of rights, promissory notes of justice, and dislocations that are going to be ameliorated, producing their own prolonged timing as the rationale for exception. How many places do we know where when you're ready, you'll get there? When you move out of underdevelopment, we'll help you develop more. I mean, that's an old history here. This is something I learned from Andre Ludefranc, from so many others working here when I was a graduate student. As subsidiaries, colonialism and democracy share in these features. Both of them do. Deferrals of rights, preemptive installations of emergency, invariably to legitimate more policing in the name of security measures. The sites of application are clearly drawn. Look at the 75 years, I wrote this before the last 3 weeks, of annihilating Palestinians by democratic racist Israel. Never just racism, not just a settler colony, but democracy claimed. More intrusions of racialized bodies, family relations severed, walls of Palestinian houses bombed out with people in them. No need to justify the invasion of the never private space of home and body. In that exemplary site in which racism is structurally embedded in the Palestinian massacres by democratic Israel, the threshold, which really struck me when I was there in Hebron, the threshold between street, balcony, and bedroom is porous. A regime of terror that prefers the night for its violence as it doesn't prefer it right now, these last few weeks. During the day, and I watched it, feces thrown on the cars of Palestinians passing too close to Jewish settlements on a religious Jewish holiday. This is a sustained project of selective duress. The ultimate goal, as we know now more than ever, is annihilation. And this I wrote in the week before what was happening now, even with the interim new school president. She's an old lefty progressive telling us that we have to mourn Israel and Israel's deaths, expressing sympathy only in her first announcement for Israeli civilian murders until the students went wild, right, and started protesting. Ignoring the decades in which Palestinians have experienced and are in the midst of the murders as their daily fare. She wrote a second statement and included, without the word Palestinian, she said, on both sides. But the word Palestinian wasn't there. Duress blurs the lines between colonial and democratic practices. Duress, durability, and duration share a politically inflected and afflicted historical etymology. It's a troubled condition born in the body, a material and psychic force exercised on muscles and mind. It may bear no immediately visible sign or may manifest in a weakened constitution and a capacity and an incapacity to bear its weight. It may be a response to force, to the quickening pressure and pacing and compression of intensified infliction. So temporality here is really, really important to what I'm thinking about. I teach a seminar on the grammars of time, and this is a critical part of it that reduces expectations, stamina, and health. Duress addresses what the Black radical US writer Ralph Ellison sought to describe, and it's one of my keys. He called it the lower frequencies of human experience. The lower frequencies of human experience. Duress may inhabit that space at an insistent pace in nonverbal registers. I see it as one of those pressures imposed unevenly by democracy's investment in carceral capitalism, unmarked supposedly unintentional segregation today. I'm not talking about before, earlier, and a debt machine that keeps people strangled, right? That colonialism have honed those strategies. I hope I don't need to rehearse, and I'm not going there. I've done that work before. One of the most glaring today is the mega plantations in Southeast Asia. I mean, they've just come up over the last 20 years, and they're extraordinary, devouring land, labor, and resources on a scale never known. Outer islands, swampland gutted, peatland, PEAT, one of the biggest stores of carbon in the world, are being destroyed by oil palm plantations, residue giving off fires that never burn out, giving off catastrophic amounts of carbon. So what we thought was the green biofuel has turned into an eco-disaster. Concepts don't stand alone. As I mentioned yesterday, as Tulaz and Guattari would insist, they are part of a constellation, never on their own. One basic set of commensurabilities that define democracy and colonialism are the fortification of interior frontiers. Frontiers that reflect and refract the parameters of inside and out, and in turn make inside and outside fierce realities. Interior frontiers can shift from fences to barbed wire, or not at all. Who is subject to them? They're not fixed. Can also change, as do normative barricades. And who is assigned, who assigns themselves, and who is assigned the guardians of those posts. Empirically, interior frontiers impose and enforce racial demarcations, those that may be quickly crafted, responsive to something going on, or built up in slow motion. Exit and entry requirements change. Ukrainians, as we know, enjoy some welcome, as opposed to those from North Africa, or with origins there who may be in France, but excluded from the interior, and who remain the internal alien over and again, with papers and asylum anyway. These exclusions could be figured as exterior frontiers, right? They're refugees coming in. But they are not only that, they are zones of abandonment that spill across interior frontiers and harden their edges. Crushed possibilities are selective, those cordoned off and coerced to come into both. When Etienne Balibar in 1990 first introduced me to the 19th century philosopher Johann Fichte's use of the term interior frontier, the latter's conviction for Germany to adhere to what Fichte, not Balibar, called invisible attachments, I was totally stopped short. Invisible attachments. We're distinguishing racial distinction with Dutch colonials in Java. They actually used the same exact term. And Dutch colonials in Java were marking who was us, read white, and who was them. Interior frontiers described racial corridors as always ambiguous racial space of those mixed. This isn't Java, I'm not talking about Brazil. Métis, mestizo, Indos, who could muddle or be the evidence. And that's what's so interesting. They could muddle and be dangerous, or be the evidence that a bifurcated world of black and white, of racial clear categories, was ever more necessary. So it's really different kind of uses. Even when race, and this was true in the Indies, was forbidden as a legal term in the early 20th century, threatening and real. Sometimes the corridors of interior frontiers were wide and remain so, separating inside and out, leaving some actually perched on those edges. As Mary Douglas has insisted, dirt is only matter out of place. In an unspoken calculus of people out of place, she hardly spoke about people out of place, right? In that wonderful book. Contaminations are enlisted as well. Out of placeness is a distinction relished by the extreme right. They're always out of place, the other. In France, there are what they call the really real French. And they use that name, les Français de souche, of the land, of the soil, of French stock, and native to France. In the Netherlands, they don't have that exact term, but somebody might tell me they do. It's not much better. There's this self-image of being open, liberal, laid back in their beer hall. It's part of a very confused message. Welcoming and exclusionary, racist, presented as in France as only of the extreme right. So the only bad people are of the extreme right? But now a Green candidate, and could we explain who may win the next election for prime minister, the self-declared racist, Geert Wilders, who stood to win, he didn't, the same position several years ago, didn't have the right-wing pedigree of Marine Le Pen that she inherited and revised from her father and made purportedly less extreme. As a French public, though, has turned ever more vocally to the extreme right. So there's this kind of meeting. Political pundits predict she's going to win the election for prime minister, just like people are predicting that Trump is going to win as well, because Biden is being so weak. It's hard to claim democratic equality in conditions not of a racist periphery, but of an overwhelming racist core. So we have always deferred, right? And still the principles of equality remain vibrant and barely touched. In the 1990s, the brilliant Black philosopher, who's not much known, Curtis Stokes, detailed a relationship between racial inequality and democracy that few people have tackled so clearly. And he called out, never seen this term, de Tocqueville's notion of two-sided equality. One for whites, and on the other, never able to be, as he put it, perfectly equal. Well, not according with the notion of an aid for inferiority. Stokes underscored that de Tocqueville warned that increasing inequality and permanent racial equality need to be and were hallmarks of the modern democratic era. That's pretty early to set it out, both analytically and politically. A prescient and durable form of racial inequality alive and well 170 years ago. It's a principle that's capacious in its effects. When the Jagossian population in the 1960s and 70s was forcibly removed from their homes in the Indian Ocean and on the Jagos archipelago, the British government had no compunction at all in doing so. It was a deal to make way for the US military installation of Diego Garcia. Years later, WikiLeaks found that it was made into a natural reserve so Jagossians could never return. Hardly ever discussed. The UN acknowledged Britain's legitimate, and they used the word colonial occupation in the 1990s, but nothing changed. As of a year ago, Jagossians remain in Mauritanian slums without relocation assistance and still without British citizenship. Look in any of the British newspapers, are living in dismal poverty next to Gatwick Airport. We know a white European population, dislocated, would never have been treated the same, right? Internal enemies. Interior frontiers may be sites of arrest and attenuated movement. Mobility is encouraged or blocked. operating in the service of defining the changing groups enlisted as internal enemies. And we know they don't stay the same. The categories: immigrant, refugee, undocumented, criminalized persons, the homeless, depending on which mix is targeted, security procedures are legitimated as protective measures, again, for order, civility, and control. Repetition of the notion of home sets the stage. There is no need to name it. It's already known. Whether in Europe or the US, the we is white. But it's not confined, and I think this is really important to consider, it's not confined to white supremacists or their silent supporters so that everybody can put them aside and hate them. Right? They're all white supremacists. Racialized sensibilities in democratic states have far more breadth. Barnard Hesse suggests a more inclusive category that I'm really taken with. He calls it white racial sovereignty, not white supremacy, that works under the radar of explicit performance and finds its expression in good liberals as well. For some, it is a habitus of sorts, as Bourdieu would tell us, a common sense, manifest in fine, attuned comportment and practice and disdain. White sovereignty underscores democratic and colonial legacies of power's common features. If theft is the one hallmark of colonialism, and we all know that, thefts under the shield of democracies should be as easy to name. We almost never talk about democracy as theft. The claim of the democratic state to the altruistic and selfless seizure of space under the state's right to declare, and I don't know how many of you know the expression, or my translator does, eminent domain. That is a particular term used in the States and elsewhere. It's a legal principle where, by a state's right, it has the right to take over any private property for public use. Elsewhere, it has a much more accessible name, and I think eminent domain is inaccessible, absolutely intentionally. It's alternately named in other states compulsory acquisition and expropriation. It is more than ironic that there's not that much left of this. It's more than ironic that the term itself was taken from the 16th eminent domain, the 16th century lawyer, Hugo Grotius, in the employ of one of the first colonial powers in the East Indies, who wrote the first laws for acquisition and access of land and sea routes, making possible the very foundation of imperial seizures. Eminent domain is a mask. Expropriation seems a more apt word to cover what democratic and colonial states have seized. In Indonesia today, it's called long-term leasing of farmland to multinational agri-industry. In the US, it remains an active form of dispossession, destroying, and it's very clear, Black communities. I mean, we could look at, oh my God, any of the elite universities, highways for those who live in the middle-class white suburbs. There is no legal protection against dislocation, since it's the law that enforces and abates and creates these shadow zones of inequalities. You can't go to the law and say, you know, this is not right. The internal enemy is the figure of fear, supposedly prompting incarceration in immigrant communities as disguised terrorists and as Muslim. People and places, nowhere, everywhere, a present potential, a category and disposition filled by a persistent and changing calibration of potential harm, often an imaginary harm mobilized with those with the power to name. The target is always in the making. It's not finite. Those people whose names are only needed for the registers of exclusion and confinements. But the internal enemy of democracies as in the US in the early 20th century, is a category unto itself under what have been called, and most people don't know about this, the ugly laws, met up with color line space in city ordinances that forbid those deemed disgusting, Black, homeless, poor, ragged, and deformed physically, considered too visible in the public domain, laying bare of violent politics, of aesthetics, that democracy joined with the politics of inequality. Arendt located violence as, I quote, the subterrane of European civilization, a subterrane that few others were to name at the time. Pulling that insight down from principles to practice might mean honing closer to the political, intimate, bodily affective forms that violence takes. One can specify further, as Achille Mbembe does, that violence is the heart of democracy. Also a direct incitement and indictment few are willing to make about democracy itself. The statement's power is its normative common sense against which it works. It's blunt. Violence is endemic to democracy now. This is not to say that relationships and policies cannot go awry repeatedly. But again, racial inequality is a necessary condition for democracy to thrive, acknowledged but epiphenomenal, right? Distinct from democracy's heart, as is inequality. For very different reasons from left and right, democracy needs repair, everyone says. On the left, it's in free fall, well, probably where I am, right? Precarious, in despair. From the Trump boys, it's reneging on its promise to expel immigrants and honor white power, to excise and punish the outlaw immigrants, Jews, and Blacks, them, and to keep us, as he uses it, safe from those dangerous penetrations. Still, for both, democracy is largely troubled from without, an inflicted wound searing democracy's flesh. The violences are not of democracy. Right now, decolonizing is, it's the hottest name that everybody's doing. But it's democracy. It's not colonial X. Let's decolonize the library. People are not looking at democracy's inequalities itself. The violences are not of democracy. In colonial situations, they're only described as reactive to assault on imperial sovereignty. Under democracy, that racism is held as a surface, if festering scar. Here, dissonance to prevailing myths of democracy is not spelled out but implied, left for us to concretize and see. But those true believers in the US as a stronghold of democracy, the inextricable binding of violence in democracy, seen as subversive on the right, again, only reactive. It's not supposed to be this way. That's what's said again. It's not supposed, this is not real democracy. It's a truth claim that's really fraught. Still, it converges with another striking warning, a caution Arendt issued from a podium in a lecture hall, and I don't know, nor anyone I know, who knows where it was nearly 70 years ago. People only know when it was. It articulates something few have configured in the violences that imperial foreign nations animate and recursively impose. Recursion, for me, is key. It's not that the same tactics are repeated, as I've argued. A recursive process entails retranscriptions, recuperations, transversal swaths, other planes of power revealed in the full. So Arendt, her claim was that avaricious pursuits of resources, cheap labor, and enormous processes could not come unencumbered. Imperial pursuits, as she put it, and I think this is really chilling, were reliant on tyranny at home. On tyranny at home. The phrase has been quoted, but no descriptions have been made of it in recent past or present to which she was referring and what she actually meant. What that tyranny looks like and at whom it was and is pressed upon. It's an insight that draws the damages of imperial pursuits in unexamined directions. Is there a tyranny on us as well as the poor? Obviously, it's closer to the frictions and violences on democracy's own ground. Her bare-boned, unadorned words must have been chilling at the time, and I think they remain so today. Imperialism relies on tyranny at home. I mean, if we had time, I could go through work of my own that I would not hold by. Metropole and colony, there's metropole doing well and colony being exploited only. I think Fred Cooper and I, Intentions of Empire, as many other people working in colonial studies, didn't look enough at both sides. We could grapple with what exactly she meant, which we can't know. It could be reduced to what both she and Foucault both described as a boomerang effect. Foucault never referred to her work, and she never referred to his. Perhaps we do better to wrestle and move forward with a range of questions that tyranny at home might prompt us to ask. Are imperial formations only sustained with active repression at home? Does that tyranny weaken and strengthen with changes in the profitability of imperial pursuits, or in the face of roadblocks to it? Is that tyranny only reactive or ever acknowledged as homegrown? It's only one more page. Is that tyranny more violent when US workers rile against the employment and wages lost when half of the jobs go elsewhere, right? In the imperial formations of which they are knowingly a part, when they see their efforts to a good life no longer secured by democracy's promises. Those of us in pursuit of the consequences of imperial exploitation somehow thought we knew where tyranny was most clearly located, in the colonial exigencies of extraction that Arendt saw as a template for democracy's fascisms. That's where she was moving with imperialism as the place to grow fascism. Our sights turned away from colonial and democratic compressions, the politics of disregard as an essential feature of imperial formations. But there's always something unsettling about Arendt's Eurocentrism and that of her critical Marxist comrades, what I was when I started graduate school very much. The rest of the world, literate or not, are never her point of reference, ever. Imperialism is abstract. It is what we did to them. It still remains a cautionary tale, an opaque warning that democracy and tyranny are not mutually exclusive. For a democracy, it may be a tyranny to sanction a myth, right? To stay in one's place for the good of the demos, to accept the promise of democracy and the promissory note it offers that equal access to the good life is in everyone's reach and will eventually come. The other myth is that people are astutely unaware of what is being done to them over generations of enormous wealth differences that are not episodic. One of the most compressed shadow zones is the democratic contract for inequality. We should better understand how the contrasts and commensurabilities are generated, regenerated, and mobilized at the same time. To conclude, for the moment only, we all have key moments when the things we thought we knew and how we know them come to seem less clear and decided. Incertitudes take concerted labor to achieve. The comforts of certitudes are hard to relinquish. One of Foucault's definitions of critique is the art of reflective insolence, right? It takes work. It's not directed towards others, but towards oneself. Sure-footedness is set aside in this notion of critique. Portals, doors, appear that one didn't even notice were there before, right? It's not that you didn't open, you didn't even see them. Wittgenstein too counseled to be wary of the smooth paths that assuredness provides Instead, he said, to treasure the friction of what he called rough ground. There are moments when the tight seams of what we had thought we knew begin to unravel, and the very fabric frays. Thank you.
Obrigada, Anne, por ter nos proporcionado essa conferência tão instigante. Acho que todas e todos aqui vamos sair hoje muito reflexivos e bastante afetados, né, com a sua conferência. Eu recebi um recadinho aqui que, pelo adiantado da hora, não teremos perguntas, tá? Mas que vocês vão poder, então, mandar e-mails para a professora Anne, para tirar algumas dúvidas, fazer um contato, ok?
If people want to ask questions now, as I said yesterday, that's fine, but often when there's so many people, don't feel that comfortable asking them. But as I've told Gabriela, I do have an email, and you may have it. And if you ask me a question, I will try to answer it. I think now it's one of the ways in which we get to communicate with those that are so far from us. So feel comfortable doing that. And also, if you have things to contribute to this, I'd love to have them. This is not the end of this work. For me, this is the beginning. I've never written a piece like this ever. And somehow Brazil made me want to write it, and not as a comparison. I really am trying to be very careful not to be that arrogant to imagine that I can say things about that. But what I imagine, you have things to say about Brazil. Does anybody have such an urgent question they want to ask it now? Please do. Anyway, thank you all for being here. Thank you for having me in Brazil. Thank you.